Well, welcome. I'm Catherine Palin, and I am so grateful that you've joined us for another program in our Art and Aging series. The series is sponsored by Elder Care Ministries of the American Baptist Churches of Rhode Island, and it features outstanding artists who are in the third of life. So today, our program focuses around poetry. So Stephen Hollaway, many of you will know as a pastor. He, before retirement, served at Harbor Church on Block Island. What you may or may not know is he is an accomplished, gifted poet. And so we are so grateful for Steve joining us today. And his focus is going to be around poetry and the spiritual life. So we've agreed for a couple of questions, and then you're going to get a chance to hear some of his poetry. So Steve, I thought we would start by seeing if you could talk about when you first found a connection with poetry and how that connection has played a role in your spiritual life.
Yeah, okay. My connection with poetry goes way back into childhood. I mean, I had a mother who would read to me poems from the Childcraft series, and it was connected really early on with me wanting to write my own poems. So like as early as the second grade, I was writing little rhyming poems and stuff. And in the third grade, I actually had my first publication, where I wrote a Mother's Day poem for my mother, and it was picked up by the Women's Missionary Union of the Southern Baptists. And they published it in their kind of women's magazine, because my mother was a missionary. So they thought it was cute. Here's this little MK writing for his mom thing. But really that's, I really haven't totally stopped writing poetry since I was a kid. Of course, once I got to college, it got a lot more serious. So we started learning a lot more about poetry than I knew when I was in high school and stuff. And it was really in college that the connection with more spiritual poetry started to happen, as I didn't know much about Christian poetry, just from the typical poems that you learn in high school and things like that. So I started reading some. I wanted to share a couple of them with you that made a big impact on me, like in my freshman year, and stayed with me forever. The first one was, and this was the subject of my first paper in my freshman year, was John Donne's sonnets, his Holy Sonnets series of religious sonnets, and it's probably the most famous one. It's called Batter My Heart, Three-Person God. So that's it's a prayer asking God to kind of knock down your walls and to even ravish you, using kind of sexual imagery, almost verging on using sexual violence as a metaphor for what God does to us. But let me just read that poem. It's short. Batter my heart, three-person God, for you as yet, but knock, breathe, shine, and seek to mend, that I may rise and stand o'erthrow me, and bend your force to break, blow, burn, and make me new. I, like an usurped town to another do, labor to admit you, but oh, to no end. Reason, your viceroy in me should defend, but is captive and proves weak or untrue. Yet dearly I love you and would be loved fain, but I am betrothed unto your enemy. Divorce me, untie or break that knot again. Take me to you, imprison me, for I, except you enthrall me, never shall be free, nor ever chaste, except you ravish me. So I was really struck by that prayer. That wasn't anything like a prayer I'd ever heard in a Southern Baptist church, and that kind of intimate communication with God through poetry and the metaphors that he used really got me. I also found out, that John Donne, while he had been known as a kind of a love poet, also became a very serious religious poet, and he was a pastor, and he was a dean of St. Paul's in London, and became a great preacher, all that. So even later in life, I could connect with him. The other poet that I got introduced to early in college that's similar, a 17th century poet, is George Herbert. So if you don't know George Herbert's work, I really encourage you to get, his whole poems is a little book. It's not very thick, and they're all worth exploring. But one of his more familiar ones is just called Love. This is Love number 3. Love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back, guilty of death and sin. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack from my first entrance in, drew me nearer, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. A guest, I answered, worthy to be here. Love said, you shall be he. I, the unkind, the ungrateful, ah, my dear, I cannot look on thee. But love took my hand and smiling did reply, who made the eyes but I? Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. And know you not, says love, who bore the blame? My dear, then I will serve. But you must sit down, says love, and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat. So both of those poems kind of introduced me to this whole realm of 17th century poems. Well, I'm not going to read any more of those to you. And I don't write 17th century poems, although at one point in college, I went on a tear writing sonnets, But they really introduced me to religious poetry in general. The other ones I want to, get you to read are not, they don't have that antique element to them that makes them a little bit difficult to understand because of the diction and everything, vocabulary occasionally. But I think the idea that you could kind of pray in poetry was important to me. What I think the effect it has on a spiritual life, I believe, of reading poetry as well as writing, is it kind of puts you in a different place from just wanting to think kind of rationally and transactionally about prayer. You're not thinking about when you're thinking poetically, you're not always thinking about just trying to make sense, right? And you are engaging your feelings, but also kind of an intuitive part of yourself to be able to connect with the divine that way, and think in images, and sometimes melody is not unlike music. Some of you probably know, have experienced music kind of connecting you with God. Starting with church music, but in other settings too, where you feel like it's just something that cannot be expressed in words. And most poetry still goes beyond the words to connect you with something. And so when you read poetry or you try to write it, either one, you have to kind of put your mind in this certain frame that's not rational, not just asking God for things and trying to get things done, but just kind of sitting with God and trying to intuit what God might be saying to you, and thinking visually. There's an awful lot of poetry in the Bible, right? And not just the books of poetry either. Most of the prophets are poets, right? And they're doing things. They could speak very directly, and just kind of like make policy points or something, but they don't. They lay it out in images and poetic language to get the word of the Lord to break through to people. And sometimes I think it can do that. I was thinking about the kind of poetry mind in terms of like Myers-Briggs types. And I think, you can be an extrovert or introvert and still like poetry. if you're going to write it, you definitely have to have some introvert to you, a part of yourself. Even if most people that know me would never guess I'm an introvert until they find out I did a lot of writing. Think, well, he's got to like being by himself then. But definitely the kind of poet brain is more on the intuitive side versus the sensing side, and at least open to the feeling side, although there's a lot of thinking involved in reading poetry. So it is kind of an intellectual activity as well. But that last pair that Myers-Briggs personality indicator, uses is the judging versus perceiving. And there, definitely you're better off with your perceiving hat on when you're trying to read poetry and not kind of make judgments about it. A thing that the kind of spirituality that poetry encourages tends to be open-ended, and willingness to leave things unresolved. You might have heard John Keats's term of negative capability, which he said was, key to poets, and that was the ability to live with questions kind of unresolved and unanswered, and not have to solve everything. And I think to me, like, that's also true for somebody who wants to pray, and also true for theologians for that matter, And I think, my own experience of like preaching for, 30 or 40 years, I think the poetry aspect and some of the, literary criticism I learned really helped me understand the Bible and communicate it in a way that's more effective because it's not as direct as just saying, okay, here's the 3 kind of simple points I'm going to get out of this text, but to be able to kind of live inside the text imaginatively and then try to communicate that to people in terms of symbols and images and stories. So I did want to keep track of the time. I did want to read a few other poets. I know I've got your interview in front of me already. So Catherine, you were going to ask me about other poets that have been important to me and ones people might enjoy, right?
That'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah, okay. So I had a few ideas. I'll show you later maybe a whole list, and I produced last night. I just produced a list of Christian poets that I would recommend that you look into if you're like looking for somebody to read. And it's about maybe 45 poets, and that's honest to God. That's mostly contemporary poets, and that's out of hundreds. I mean, it is amazing. If you live in the poetry world, it's amazing how many Christians there are. There's something about poetry, I think, that Christians are drawn to, at least a certain kind of Christian. But there are many, many. I mean, I'm not talking about in Christian journals or Christian schools or something. I'm talking about in all the best literary journals and the award winners and who gets the Pulitzers and all that stuff. There's just a surprising number of people. And I mean, they're Christian in the sense that they're believers, and not necessarily Christian in the sense that they're going to write only, predominantly about religious topics. Although there's a lot of stuff about that. But a few people I want to introduce you to that you probably don't know. One is a woman named Anne Porter, and I thought she'd be perfect for this group because Anne Porter, she was the wife of a famous painter, Fairfield Porter, who was like mostly a landscape artist in New England. And I love his work, but Anne Porter didn't publish anything until he died, right? She was just kind of the submissive in the background wife, And then her first book came out when she was 83. So, and then she had a second book after that, you know, and she lived to be almost 100. But here's a poem from her. Her collected poems is called Living Things. And I would highly recommend that book. It's real easy to understand. It's not kind of some obscure thing. Okay, this is called Music. When I was a child, I once sat sobbing on the floor beside my mother's piano as she played and sang, for there was in her singing a shy yet solemn glory my smallness could not hold. And when I was asked why I was crying, I had no words for it. I only shook my head and went on crying. Why is it that music at its most beautiful opens a wound in us, an ache, a desolation deep as a homesickness for some far off, half forgotten country? I've never understood why this is so, but there's an ancient legend from the other side of the world that gives away the secret of this mysterious sorrow. For centuries on centuries, we have been wandering, but we were made for paradise as a deer for the forest. And when music comes to us with its heavenly beauty, it brings us desolation, for when we hear it, we half remember that lost native country. We remember the fields, their fragrant windswept clover, the bird songs and the orchids, the wild white violets and the moss by the transparent streams. And shining at the heart of it is the longed for beauty of the one who waits for us, who will always wait for us, in those radiant meadows, yet also came to live with us and wanders where we wander. Isn't that beautiful? I just love that. Yeah, I've got a couple of other samples of the kind of poets I think you might like. This is a very short one by Denise Levertov. So Denise Levertov is a great Christian poet, but she didn't become a Christian until late in her life. And she had one Jewish parent, but she wasn't like a practicing Jew, but she converted and became a Christian and wrote a lot of really nice spiritually oriented poetry. This little poem's called The Avowal, which I've used at the end of sermons more than once. As swimmers dare to lie face to the sky and water bears them, as hawks rest upon air and air sustains them, so I would learn to attain free fall and float into Creator Spirit's deep embrace, knowing no effort earns that all surrounding grace. So here's another kind of, these are all fairly upbeat ones I'm reading for you, these little samples. This is a poem by R.S. Thomas, and you've probably heard of Dylan Thomas, but this is another Thomas from Wales. Thomas is a Welsh name, very common, but R.S. Thomas was a pastor in Wales. He's actually a Church of England pastor, but he lived in, he spent his whole life, kind of like George Herbert, in a country church. And he writes a lot about these country, very plain people. I mean, it's like, I don't know, it's like me being in a little village in Appalachia or something, but he wrote this poem his whole life. I mean, he's gone now, but he not that long ago. So, but this poem is called The Bright Field. I've seen the sun break through to illuminate a small field for a while and gone my way and forgotten it. But that was the pearl of great price, the one field that had a treasure in it. I realize now that I must give all I have to possess it. Life is not hurrying on to a receding future, nor hankering after an imagined past. It is the turning aside, like Moses, to the miracle of the lit bush, to a brightness that seemed as transitory as your youth once, but is the eternity that awaits you. I hope you like that one. There's, okay, one more I'm going to read. then we'll do something else. This is by a guy named Maurice Manning. Maurice Manning is from Kentucky, and he's kind of a country-ish guy, and he's teaching in Lexington now at Transylvania University. But he had a book just a few years ago called Bucolics, and bucolics sort of means like country poems, and they were all little poems that they're all prayers, really, talking to God, but he always calls God boss with a capital B, right? So he's always addressing like, boss, why is this the way it is? And it's a really, that book, Bucolics, one time at Harvard Church, I did a sermon of nothing but poems from that book. I was just so taken with them, and I just read a bunch of those prayers that it's really worth finding. But let me just read you one of them. This is number 4. You move in every direction at once. You're worse than the wind, boss. Worse than a rock dropped in the water. Here, there, everywhere, that's you. You're like the sunshine, always reaching. Does it make you happy, boss? You must have fun the way you dilly-dally in the grass from blade to blade. I hear you laughing. I hear you clap your hands. I see what happens next. Blackbirds hit the air. The treetops wave goodbye. What a life. You have it easy, boss. You put me in stitches, how you spin the stars with just a finger. Amen. That's the end of that one. So let's continue with your interview. Yes, some questions, more questions for me.
Sure. You talked a little bit about when you began writing poetry, like because your mom read you and you were a preschooler. And some folks may know that in retirement, you're working on a Master of Fine Arts in Poetry. And so how has your poetry, because we're going to ask you in a minute to read some of your poems, but how has it evolved? And maybe especially as you think as you aged, has it changed? And in what way has it changed? And what made you think that doing an MFA right now was the right thing to do?
Yeah. Well, I tell you what, I have always had this kind of struggle between whether I was going to be a poet or a minister. So when I finished college, I was definitely going to be, sorry, I hit a wrong button. I was definitely trying to be a poet. And I decided the only way that I could be a poet and survive was to be a college professor, which was, I mean, back in those days, actually, the MFAs were very rare. That the whole industry hadn't started yet. And it is an industry now, it's huge. But pretty much what you had to do was like, go get a PhD, and then you'll teach in some faculty somewhere, and then you'll have time to write your poem books on the side. So I started down that path, and after I finished my master's, I thought, I really don't want to do this. And least of all, do I want to teach freshman composition the rest of my life? And anything I have write my dissertation about is going to, of necessity, be so obscure that nobody cares about it. Right? I mean, that's almost a definition, a requirement for a dissertation topic. So I thought, I don't think I want to go down this path. And I was struggling with that. Oh, also there was the fact that this was 1975, and it was one of those periods when there were a lot more graduates than there were faculty positions open, as has often been the case. But this was a particularly bad time. So I was at Duke for my studying Southern literature, and there were all these people around who were PhDs who were like, waitresses at Shoney's or something. And I thought, that is so depressing. Like, I'm going to spend 3 or 4 more years on my dissertation and all this, and that's where I'm going to wind up, And so while I was struggling about that, I don't think it was just opportunism, but I think I really heard God say to me, Steve, why did you want to be a teacher, And I said, well, honestly, I just wanted to sit in my office, kind of like my advisor did, and talk to students about the meaning of life. And so God said, well, why don't you just do that? So all of a sudden it dawned on me like, wow, I'd have a lot more fun as a college chaplain than as a college professor. So I just shifted gears, went to seminary, went back to Princeton to go to seminary. And I worked in campus ministry for a dozen years before I finally decided I felt a need to kind of move on to more preaching and to work with more adults, like older adults. But all along, I've kind of it's been sporadic. I mean, sometimes I've been very faithful and getting up every morning and working on poetry, and sometimes I've gone long stretches with not much writing. Twice before, I applied to MFA programs. Once was like early. I'd only been in ministry like 45 years. And I thought like, well, I don't know, maybe I need to rethink this question about being a writer. So I applied, I got admitted, I got offered a fellowship and everything. But then I guess we just had a baby, and I thought about the practicalities of it and the amount of money that we were going to have to live on. There was I was getting paid a fair salary as a campus minister. I wasn't getting rich at all, but what they were going to pay me to be a graduate assistant, was like terrible, poverty wages. I can't do that to my wife and my child. It's like, so I put that aside. Then years later, when I was a pastor in Kentucky before I came to Block Island, and I decided I would do one of these, and they had MFAs that are non-resident. You only have to go like 2 or 3 weeks in the summer, and then you can do the rest of the work. So I went for the summer. This was at a place called Murray State. They had a really nice program, and it was cheap. And I loved the summer residency for like 2.5 weeks. And then I went home, and the requirement of the program was you had to spend 25 hours a week in reading and writing book reports of all the reading you were doing, and sometimes writing poetry. And that lasted about 2 weeks before I thought, this is nuts. How can I am a 60-hour-a-week pastor. There's no way I can do this. What was I thinking? I can't do 25 hours a week. So, after I kept at it another couple of weeks, and then I got in touch with the people at the program, said, I'm so sorry, I just can't do this. So now I'm retired. So finally I can do it, right? So I'm so happy. Plus the fact that Maryland, like many states, has tuition waivers for all retired people. So state universities all over the country have this. I don't know if Rhode Island has it, but they give a tuition waiver for anybody you have to be over 60, and you have to be living on retirement, not like working. You can't work any more than 20 hours a week. And you have to prove that you're getting Social Security. And then you don't have to pay tuition. So it's fantastic. Yeah. I feel kind of guilty being with these. I mean, I'm not the only retiree in my program, but I'm working with kids who are, in their 20s and 30s, and they're like taking on debt and working full time and trying to do this. And I've got it so easy compared to them. Anyway, that's how I wound up in the MFA. And I really don't care about the degree, to tell you the truth. I just want my poetry to get better. And I probably will finish the degree, but I told the director of the program, I'm not in a hurry. I mean, there's no reason I have to finish like in 3 years is the normal frame. I don't care if it takes me 4 or 5 years. Because what am I going to do? I'm not leaving to take a job teaching somewhere. I'm done with that. So I don't have to work, so I'm not going to work like that. Just preaching here and there and giving poetry readings, that would be fun. So you want me to read a few poems for you?
Please.
Okay. All right. This first one is ask the question, am I a poet? If someone says, I am the president, without thinking to himself, I play one on TV, that person may have lost himself. If clergy introduce themselves saying, I am the pastor, preacher, priest, without meaning I play that role, I worry where the self has hidden. And if I say I am a poet, what bothers me is not the nagging sense that I'm a fraud. I mean, we all feel that, but that am is too strong a word, as if it were certain, an equivalence between the self, the gift, the work. Plato said poets are liars. Perhaps the first lie is claiming to be one. Aristotle said poets grasp the real truth. To believe him is a danger to the soul. The Hebrew poets, we remember, said that the rest were liars because they were paid to please and mistook optimism for hope. The true poet said a word that came from somewhere else. It was a fire and a burden and a vision separate from the speaker, something out there for you to take or leave. I am not a prophet means more than no schooling. I do not claim to be a reliable source. I have only this word, and who I am is both more and less. There's only one who can say, I am. The rest is consequence and contingency, acting in roles as best we can, using the words we have been given. This next poem is a song, and it comes from a particular period in my life. Most of the poems I'm going to read are like brand new, but this one is from many years ago when I went through a church conflict. I'd been at this church 13 years, but it was a Southern Baptist church in New Jersey. And I was kind of like dealing with the changes in the Southern Baptists as they got more and more fundamentalist. But then in 2000, they passed a new statement of faith that said women can't be pastors. And as soon as I got that, came across my screen in like a news from the Baptist News, I thought, I just can't do that. I mean, not only did I not believe it theologically and biblically, but, I had mentored women who were pastors now. I had women who were pastor colleagues. I know, Corey obviously is full of women pastors. And so you can imagine the conflict that I might have been in. And eventually I decided I just had to leave, that I couldn't get that church to move enough away from the Southern Baptists that I could stay. So I knew I was kind of put adrift, and I got 6 months severance to figure out what to do next with my life. And I interviewed with 15 churches. It was not fun. But that's when I wrote this. So this is, I just titled it Psalm. And the epigraph is from Psalm 63. On my bed, I remember you. I think of you through the watches of the night. As a man going deaf learns to read music, so I am learning to read your word, oh God. As a guest memorizes the layout of a room before turning out the light, I'm learning to find you in the dark. As a child rests easy in a mother's arms after the song has ended, I am learning to rest in your silence. Once nostalgia was the enemy, faith looked forward and all that mattered was what you said today. Now that I find myself in the middle of the way, in the middle of the night, in dreams and disorientation, the distinction between remembrance and hope seems merely technical. Like a long married couple, we travel sometimes without speech. I no longer ask at every junction if you know the way. The history of our journey means more than what the headlights show. Speak to me, Lord, or do not speak. Show me the path you choose, or simply take me there. Only let me trust in you. Thank you. I want to read two poems that have to do with aging that are both written in the last few weeks. This one begins with an image of Nights on Block Island, and I posted, I know you can't see this, but I posted a picture of the Milky Way on a Block Island sky to go with the poem, because if you're on Block Island in the right kind of weather, it's just amazing. It's like a river up there, you know, and I've never seen that many stars before anywhere. So the title at the moment for this poem is Those Island Nights. Those island nights, the heavens had no competition. Our small star flotsam on the edge of a great river. I learned I was gazing at things that might no longer exist. No human can see the stars, only the light they sent millions of years ago. No more can I see myself as I am, only the light from stories, misremembered, remembered, constructing a self from what no longer exists. Everything I know about myself is old news, an anthology reflecting the tastes of the editor, but paging through it comforts like starshine. We use constellations to give names and stories to the light. I am searching the skies of my own life like a world book for a myth I can use. Even the firmament is not what it was. And here's one more similar themed. Tulip trees below the Washington Monument in Baltimore, which is right in my neighborhood. And this poem is very much influenced by Rumi, a Persian mystic poet from the 13th century. And the epigraph comes from Rumi. What was said to the rose that made it open was said to me here in my chest. The patience that holds the twisted arms of the tulip tree until it blooms in 400 places has settled in my deep breaths. In the season of glory, you open me and I blush. In the long passage of green, you make me rest in my own shade. When renown drops like petals, I will remember I was beautiful. The ghosts of blossoms haunt my branches like youth. It is you who make me flower in age, bearing the ripe fruit of yearning. I do not forget who I am, perfectly intended. Okay, an Easter poem. This was written for this last Easter. Every empty space can be read as a sign of God's absence or as evidence that God is not where we left him. We go to decorate the last place we saw him and find God has deserted death and claimed his freedom. We had assumed he would stay put, unchanging his essence, even though he told us he was like wind, fountain, river. We know this world is in motion within the motion of other worlds, in spinning galaxies, the whole creation moving ever away. We are not children who think the world is simple and still. Everything moves, entangling love, holding it together. There is no standing at the mouth of the cave and wishing him back. there is only finding him on the road where he has been walking all along. This next one is a conversation with Mary Oliver, who, I mean, she's gone to be with the Lord now, but Mary Oliver was, well, along with Rumi, the best-selling poet in America. And so a lot of her poem is nature poetry. And Mary's kind of an interesting case because when she started out, she was like totally she's spiritual, but not religious. That was her whole thing. And then she, later in her life, especially after she lost her partner of several decades, she turned completely to the church, and became like a member of the altar guild at the Episcopal Church in her little retirement town and everything, and began to use explicitly religious language in her poems. But I am responding to her most famous poem here, which I'm going to quote at the beginning, the second half of it. This is from Mary Oliver. She said, "I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel down in the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I have been doing all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" So that poem has provoked many people to ask themselves that question, including me. So here's my kind of, this is an assignment for a class, but this is kind of my reply to Mary. I don't know how to pay attention. Ask my wife, but I do know what prayer is. How to open up a space for silence, to seek what is within and beyond the visible, even the grass, the grasshopper, the hopping. If I'm not paying attention, it's because my eyes are inside, checking the soul's weather, its storms and sparks, watching the winds I walk into, zones of high pressure and low. You ask this old man what I plan to do with my one wild, etc. The question lingers. I seek my vocation every morning. There is so much left to do. 30 years ago, we were young enough to plot future, but now we know that we do not know enough to plan. Once I heard a Navajo flute held by a singer on a church porch, played by an evening breeze from the sea. I have been played as you have. Listening for the music is prayer. Kneeling in the grass, thinking how we die, speaking a poem, all prayer. After Molly died, you admitted as much. You turned to outright invocation and spoke naively the words of the church. You tore fancy words from your heart, you said, and then you named as prayer what you always did on the grass, paying attention, then patching a few words together. It was never a contest, you said, but a doorway into thanks and silence. So how are we doing, Kathy? You want me to read any more poems, or?
Why don't you read another poem or two, and then we'll let people ask some questions.
Right, okay. Okay, this poem is called Unsigned. And actually, I have to say, it's based on my assumption that that most of the Psalms in the book of Psalms are unsigned, in the sense that we don't know who the authors are, right? And even if there's an attribution listed, it's probably not who it was written by. So They wrote for hire, the psalmists, members of guilds, no royalties, though royals sometimes claimed authorship. The poets are unknown as God would have it. No other way could they have spoken to God's face and not held back, not giving a damn what the first audience would think. How long, O Lord? Why do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself? It is not enemies that taunt me, it is you. I think of you and I moan. No one dared sign his name, but God. These are my words for you to use against me. I know that you will need to. Such a gift to weep under the shadow of her wing, to pound the eagle's breast with tiny fists, to sing the blues full-throated in his hearing. I use the weapon words placed in my hand. I sing the verse an unknown poet and the sometimes unknown God put in my mouth. I wish my own children felt safe enough to cry out accusations of my failure, to say I am absent. They no longer believe in me. I wish I could write desolation as a song so they would know I know. Because I cannot bear such honesty, I will never be as intimate as the silent God. Maybe one more. This one's about the pandemic. So this might be a little more out there, but it's called Faith Survives Plague Like Roaches. It's 3 parts, so 3 stanza-ish. Number 1, faith survives plague like roaches the blast. As a boy falling through ice is saved by shock, life frozen. As a baby pulled from Turkish rubble manages a cry. Bubonic bodies memento mori drove parishioners to desperate prayer. But philosophers' faith collapsed with Lisbon's churches All Saints' Day, 60,000 dead at Mass. The 1918 flu spared theology, if not the millions, but Europe's senseless, endless war the year before left thinking faith dead in trenches. 2, it is some solace that we are creatures thrust into symbiosis and competition with tiny things, as well as with the uncreated who intended such lush chaos. We are dependent hosts inhabited by a hive of bacterial relatives who won't move out. Almost animals thriving in testing caged in a zoo that keeps zookeepers well. Viruses are not alive, but can adapt, attack like bad robots, androids programmed to hitch a ride and kill the driver, or better, keep alive, torture, multiply. 3, sing, all creatures great and small, the Lord God made them all. Intelligent design includes the grave intelligence of death. Omnipotence is a liability, a God who sends presidents and pestilence, a black hole for prayer and praise. Turn we now to the bleeding God who suffers our humanity as a sickness, the infected God invading our inveterate hearts with the germ of unapparent life, the indefatigable bug. Okay. I think I'll stop there.
Thanks, Steve. Well, now it's your turn to ask if you've got questions you want to ask Steve about poetry, about his poetry, about poetry you might read. It's up to you. Just need to unmute yourself and ask the question. Meredith?
Steve, how do we get copies of your poetry?
I can, those ones that I read, I can just send them to Catherine. But I'm actually kind of in the process of trying to submit a lot of these to journals and things, you know. That's another problem I've had over the years is I rarely got around to submitting to people, you know. When I was in college, I did, and I had, you know, some things, quite a lot published right then, but in my full-time working life, I haven't spent much time on submission. I just wrote for myself, you know, or for friends. So the answer to the question is I can send poems to Catherine and she can pass them around. Hey, Catherine, can I share my screen? Can you, to show that
I think you should be
list?
able to do it.
There's something that you have to do to give me permission to share my screen that I don't
I
know.
thought you should be able to. Hang on one second.
Well,
all right,
even
now.
if
Now you
you
should
think
be
it's,
able to.
you think I can?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
See if you can now.
All right. Yeah. Okay, here we go. Okay. So I had just put together a list of Christian poets and some classics at the very first: Don Herbert, Hopkins, T.S. Eliot, and Langston Hughes. Those are kind of more or less, you know, old timers. But then contemporary poets or late 20th century poets. So I have a long list here, and this one, Catherine said she could email this list to people.
Right.
And some I marked with the asterisk ones that I recommend. Wendell Berry from Kentucky, Les Murray from Australia. He's probably the greatest Australian poet. He's a profound Christian who's also struggled with depression. Has a great book about depression. Denise Levertov, I mentioned, I read one of hers earlier. Christian Wyman, who was converted at midlife when he had cancer and almost died. And he was the editor of the journal Poetry, kind of leading journal in the field, for about 10 years. Now he teaches at Yale Divinity School. He's wonderful. Jane Kenyon and Donald Hall were married to each other and lived in a little village in New Hampshire, I think, and went to the little village church. And you know, where Donald Hall had, when he married, he wasn't even a believer, but he started going to the church. And then after he'd been in church a while, you know how this goes, he decided he was a believer. and thank God he was a believer before his wife died. Nate Klug is kind of a new friend. He's a young poet he's been in a lot of the best journals. He's a UCC pastor out in California. And I've been in touch with him and sending him poems lately, but he's really worth looking at. Nate Klug, he's a new guy. Lee Young Lee, I put PK because he's a Presbyterian pastor's son, but he's like a very kind of, I don't know, intensely kind of mystical poet, but he's just some of the most beautiful poems you've ever seen. He grew up in, he spent his childhood, I think, in Indonesia, but then they had to leave as kind of Chinese Christian refugees. I mean, ethnically Chinese, were kind of chased away. Morris Manning and Ann Porter were two that I read from at the beginning. And Tanya Runyon is just a regular old school teacher in Indiana, but she writes all biblical poems. She has a wonderful book about poems about 10 women in the Bible. And she's actually got quite a bit of recognition. This guy, Patrick Otuama, I also really recommend. He also writes prayers and things. He's the head of a kind of semi-monastic community in Ireland, the Corey Mila community. Mary Oliver is one that I was talking to. And Mary Carr is another person that she's best known as a memoirist, but and her memoirs are fantastic too, but her poems are great. The book I'm especially thinking of is one called Welcome Sinners. And she has a lot of Christian themes in there. And R.S. Thomas is that a pastor from Wales that I read one poem of. A lot of his poems are darker than the one I read, but he's definitely worth checking out. So, and then there's a whole lot of other people on there that I would encourage you to look at. So let me unshare my screen. Okay, here we go. We have some, hey, Ted, George, and hi. I wanted to say to you that Catherine's recording this. So you can, it'll be put up where you can see the whole thing. You want, okay? Yeah.
Other questions?
Where's the question coming from? I can't see.
I'm trying to look and see if I see any hands.
Go ahead with your question.
If you've got a question, Don,
Don's got
unmute
one.
yourself.
Yeah, can you click your mute button, Don, the little microphone?
Okay, there we go.
There we go.
Yeah, Steve, I wonder if you could comment on the difference between listening to poetry as it's being read to you versus sitting down in a comfortable chair and reading it at your own pace.
Yeah.
Comment on that?
Yeah, well, that's a good point. Sometimes when you go to I go to a lot of poetry readings actually, even during Zoom era, and sometimes I just can't get it as fast as it's coming out, So it's nice if I can buy the book or get it from the library, and read through it at my own pace. On the other hand, virtually all poems are meant to be sound events, and kind of read out loud. So the ideal thing is it's nice to go to readings because you get a feel for the personality of the poet, which helps you interpret what you're reading in the book. Because you can kind of imagine that person saying it once you've actually met them or heard them on Zoom or something. But I think the ideal thing is to sit quietly, with your cup of tea or whatever, an easy chair, and read it slowly, but at least in your head, read it out loud. If you're one of those speed readers that never sub-vocalizes, you have to kind of break that habit. You have to read slowly and kind of hear it in your head, or read it out loud. That's fine too. Or, read it to your wife or something. It'll work. But I think that's a good point you make, that may even be true of my poems. There are sort of two kinds of poets in the world, ones that want to be understood and ones that don't want to be understood. So, and there's a lot of poets, especially if they work in an academic setting, that obscurity is a virtue, and they'll, and some, it's also more hip in some circles. I have a nephew who's a poet. He's a lawyer who works in the DOJ, and he went to NYU and he got in this kind of New York school of poets where like the surface meaning is like not important. It's kind of this general kind of the painting. They're more like Jackson Pollock paintings or something with words. And my cousin will send me nice little signed. My nephew rather, he'll send me nice little signed editions of his poetry, and I have no idea what it's about. But there's not anybody like that in that list that I gave to Catherine, just showed you. They're all people that want to make some kind of sense. You don't want, in poetry, you don't want to make the kind of sense you could make in prose. If you're going to give a sermon, there's no reason to put it in a poem. You might as well just say it, right? And poets don't like people asking, well, what does that poem mean, right? Well, it means what it said, because the evocation that's and the feeling that's coming out and everything, that's what it means. Doug, you had something?
Yeah, well, but you were starting to talk about it. I was going to ask the relationship between your poetry and your preaching.
Yeah, yeah,
There has to be some relationship. I can't imagine it doesn't inform it to some degree.
sure. Right. Well, I mean, I do occasionally stick a poem inside of a sermon or at the end of a sermon or something, but I think a bigger connection is kind of the way of reading the text and stuff, and maybe, and sometimes, I don't know, the way of using language. You could ask Beth Tingwall, she's listening. She's heard hundreds of my sermons. So, but I think there's more, I don't know, I'd say I'm not, I always worked from a manuscript. And part of that was because I wanted more control over the sound and the diction and everything, that more like a line of a poem, and not just improvising. When I was young and first starting out, I just kind of used a little outline, and I wandered a lot, and the language wasn't very careful. So, when I grew up, I changed that. There are people who would hate to ever preach from a manuscript, and feel bound by it, but, and I try not to look at it very much, but I want to have written it out, so I pick the words carefully. So I don't know. I mean, sometimes I think the reason my sermons work to the degree that they have is because I'm a good writer, better more than I'm a great preacher.
As someone who's heard Steve's preaching, he is a beauty to hit the language he uses, and there's a carefulness to it that I so appreciate, and it's also the way he reads text. So he won't say that about himself, but it's some of the things I appreciate. So we have time for one more question. Eva, go.
Well, it's not really a question, and I don't know this gentleman, but I appreciate what I've heard today. And, you talked about being grown up, but I will see you always as a little boy in the woods with your wagon, and a teddy bear is in the wagon. And as you go along, you're collecting your verbiage for your poetry. I like to write poetry myself.
Uh-huh.
And you mentioned one time about being inside yourself. I am an introvert, and I go inside, and I have to bring it out. And in so doing, of course, you're exposing yourself, but that's when I find that people appreciate me, because I'm not really a talker, but to me, you will always be. And again, I don't know you, but I appreciate you. One of your poems you read, I was crying, and I will always see you as the little boy in the woods,
Yeah.
the wagon and the teddy bear. So thank you.
I think that's a pretty good intuition, that there's this child inside me still. Yeah. I did last year. I put out a little book. I mean, as part of our MFA program, we had to like I learned software for publishing and everything, and we had to publish our own little book, like a chapbook of like 40 pages, and mine was called The Mother Poems, because it was a whole collection of poems I've written about my mother, and most of them had to do with when I was a child. So there are poems like that mostly they're kind of narrative poems. And my mother was a missionary who suffered terribly from migraines and depression, and was occasionally suicidal, and so she was hospitalized for that, and there's a lot of tough stuff we went through in early adolescence especially, but a lot of that, working through those poems, have been healing for me over the years, from I mean, starting in college, I wrote a poem that I dared not show my mother, about how I felt about things, but she did see it eventually, and she didn't kill herself. Oh, that was good. I was relieved. Yeah.
Well, Steve, we could go on for so much longer, but thank you for sharing about your life story and about your connection to poetry, but thank you especially for sharing your poetry. As always, it's just extraordinary. So thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who joined us. We will have a recording posted, and I've got everyone's email, so I'll send it. And Steve's going to send me the list he showed of poets and then some of his poems, and I'll circulate those. And I hope you'll join us on May 13th, so in a month, when Ann Corden, who's an award-winning painter, who is a member of my current